The sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting soft golden streaks across the room. Emma stretched, glancing at the clock on the bedside table before slipping quietly out of bed. She paused at Liam's door, peeking in to see him still fast asleep, his arm flung over his pillow in peaceful abandon. She smiled, the sight of him always managing to steady her heart. In the kitchen, the familiar hum of the coffee maker filled the silence. Emma cradled the mug in her hands, leaning against the counter as memories of the event the night before drifted into her mind. Matthew. He'd stood on that stage with a calm, commanding presence, his words filled with purpose. There was no denying the admiration she felt for him. His confidence, his vision, it was captivating. But then there had been his parents. They hadn't even looked her way, but their presence was unmistakable. Emma had felt the shift in Matthew's demeanor the moment they arrived. His smile had dimmed just slightly, his shoulders stiffening, even as he maintained his poise. That tension, she realized, was the same look he'd worn the first time they met, a guardedness that hinted at battles fought long before she knew him. She took a sip of her coffee, her thoughts turning inward. Matthew seemed lighter now, especially when they were with Liam. The way he played with her son, how genuine his laughter was. It had been a long time since Emma had seen that kind of joy in someone. It reminded her of how far they'd both come in such a short time. And yet, Emma's fingers tightened slightly around the mug. What was she doing? Her life, while far from perfect, was finally stable. She'd worked so hard to give Liam the kind of security he needed after everything they'd been through. Stability. That was what mattered most. Matthew's world didn't feel stable. It felt enormous, unfamiliar, and uncertain. And while he seemed so different now, more grounded, more open, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong in that world. But then there was Liam. Matthew had already made such a difference in her son's life. Liam's confidence was growing, his smile brighter. The bond between them was undeniable, and Emma couldn't help but be grateful for the man who had stepped into their lives so unexpectedly. The sound of footsteps pulled her from her thoughts. Liam appeared in the doorway, rubbing his eyes and yawning. "Morning, buddy," Emma said, setting her mug down and kneeling to give him a hug. "Are we going to the park to meet Matthew today?" Liam asked, his voice hopeful. Emma hesitated, her heart tugging in two directions. "We'll see," she said, standing and reaching for her phone. As she unlocked it, a message from Matthew lit up the screen. "I can't make it to the park this morning, but if you and Liam are up for it, lunch at mine this afternoon?" Emma's brow furrowed slightly. At his place? They'd never been there before. She glanced at Liam, who was already bounding toward the cereal box, blissfully unaware of her inner turmoil. Her finger hovered over the screen, her thoughts swirling. She couldn't deny that the invitation felt like another step forward, closer to something she wasn't sure she was ready for. But as she looked back at Liam, her resolve softened. Matthew had become a part of their lives in ways she hadn't expected. And maybe, just maybe, this was the next step they were meant to take. With a deep breath, she typed back a response. "We'd love to." The Harrington mansion was a masterpiece of grandeur and old-world opulence. Marble columns lined the entrance hall, leading to vast rooms adorned with crystal chandeliers, gilded molding, and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked meticulously manicured gardens. Deep within the mansion, past ornate doors, and a gallery of ancestral portraits lay the private pool room, a space reserved for the family's leisure. The pool itself was framed by polished marble tiles, the water shimmering under the light of a massive skylight above. Elegant chaise lounges were arranged neatly around the edges, their cushions untouched and pristine. The air was cool, the faint scent of chlorine lingering in the background. Matthew sat across from his parents in this gilded space, the weight of their judgment as stifling as the silence between them. Richard sat with his usual composure, his sharp suit tailored to perfection, while Eleanor's posture was rigid, her hands resting delicately on her lap. Both exuded the kind of power and poise that came with generations of wealth. "This is absurd, Matthew," Richard began, his voice cutting through the stillness. "All this nonsense about community programs and single mothers. You're embarrassing yourself." Eleanor's gaze was as cold as her tone. "Darling, why can't you see how unbecoming this is? You're a Harrington. Sympathy isn't our strength. It makes you look weak." Matthew kept his expression neutral, but the tightening of his jaw betrayed his frustration. Their disdain was nothing new, but hearing it spoken so plainly still struck a nerve. "What makes me weak," he said evenly, his voice low and steady, "is sitting here listening to this." Richard's sharp eyes narrowed as he leaned forward slightly, his voice laced with condescension. "You're wasting time and resources. You hold the family name. Without you, this entire empire—" "Without me," Matthew interrupted, his tone rising just enough to cut him off. "You'd be nothing but a relic, a name fading into irrelevance while the world moved on." Richard straightened, his expression darkening, but Matthew pressed on, his resolve unshaken. "I built my success. I've carried this name on my back, and I will not let you dictate what I can or cannot do with it." Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line, her disapproval radiating. "This obsession with that single mother is unbecoming. You could have the best the world has to offer." "And as many as you like," Richard added, his smirk returning with a cruel edge. "You have the privilege of choice. Don't waste it on scraps." Matthew stood abruptly, his movements deliberate and controlled. He braced his hands on the marble table, leaning forward slightly as he looked at his parents. Two people who had shaped his world, but had no idea who he truly was. "Emma and Liam are not scraps," he said, his voice sharp and unyielding. "Gwen was not just a woman we employed. These are the people who taught me what matters: compassion, kindness, strength, things you've spent your lives avoiding." Richard leaned back in his chair, his smirk fading into a steely stare. Eleanor turned her gaze away, shaking her head in quiet dismay, as though the sight of her son challenging them was too much to bear. Matthew straightened, his tone softening but losing none of its conviction. "I don't need your blessing to give back or to care about people you think are beneath you. But I'll say this: do not, ever, speak about Gwen, Emma, Liam, or the work I'm doing in the community like that again. Not in my presence." Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked away from the pool room, his footsteps echoing across the polished marble floor. The weight of their judgment lingered, heavy and cold, but Matthew felt lighter as he left the mansion behind. He had drawn his line in the sand. This was his path now, and he wasn't looking back. As Matthew pulled away from the Harrington mansion, the gates closed behind him with a quiet finality. The late morning sun filtered through the car's windshield, casting soft patterns of light across the dashboard. He kept his hands steady on the wheel, but his mind lingered on the confrontation he had just left behind. His parents' words had been sharp, their disapproval cutting, but it wasn't the sting of their judgment that lingered. It was the sense of liberation. For years, he had driven these roads burdened by the weight of expectation, the unspoken rules of a legacy that demanded perfection. But today was different. Today, he wasn't leaving as their obedient son trying to prove his worth. He was leaving as a man who had finally found his own. The winding estate road stretched out before him, giving way to open countryside dotted with quiet farms and small villages. The distant silhouette of the city lay on the horizon, beckoning him toward the life he was ready to build. The hum of the engine beneath him felt like a quiet rhythm, matching the resolve in his chest. Matthew didn't glance back at the mansion shrinking in his rearview mirror. His focus was ahead, on a life defined not by wealth, but by purpose. And as the sun climbed higher, so did his certainty. The path he had chosen wasn't easy, but it was his. And that made all the difference.